Okay, good morning to everybody, and I think we'll go ahead and get started. It looks like it's 9 o'clock, and looking at a lot of snow outside here. I'm a little surprised the campus was open, but given the snow situation, but I think it came down so fast and so late in the morning that nobody had the opportunity to do anything about it. But anyway, thanks to those who are joining on the live link, and for those who are watching us sometime after the fact. We'll be covering the rest of chapter 8 here this morning, and we'll get into chapter 9, which we've already sort of opened the door a little bit to previously by talking a bit about inflation, that is price level changes. And we'll talk a bit more about both of these phenomena. And then we'll sort of tie both of these together by simply making the point that those are really the two main macro problems that policymakers, which we're going to define as government policymakers, are trying to steer between those sort of two hazards. On the left side of the road would be inflation, for instance, in the ditch that would be, and then on the right side of the road would be unemployment, and or vice versa. And trying to keep the car between the lines is essentially what's happening. And those automotive metaphors come up again and again when it comes to macro policy. It's viewed as driving the car not too quickly, not too slowly, and using information that's all in the rearview mirror because it's all historical information, as we've said before. So if we don't get through chapter 9, I think we'll probably get most of the way through. If we don't, we'll pick it up on Tuesday and finish that. Chapter 10 is assigned. I want to go quickly through chapter 10. I don't want to spend lots of time on it. It's a fairly deep chapter, and I think that there are a lot of, I think it's probably going to, if we spend too much time on it, I think it takes away from some of the time I'd rather spend doing other things, frankly. International economics is in itself probably another, well, at least one course of study. And so the whole idea of international trade and capital flows, we will talk a bit about, and we may talk a bit about currency, relationships, that is dollar versus euro, dollar yen, that sort of thing. But what I really want to do is get into chapter 11. And this actually wasn't scheduled in the syllabus until week 8. Week 8 is the week of the second exam. It'll be the very same setup as last time. Excuse me. So it'll be the Thursday of week 8, which is 2 weeks from today. You can take it in class, or you can take it in one of the testing centers, or as I suspect, given last exam's experience, you'll probably want to take it online in Brightspace, and it'll be available that Thursday. It'll be available through the end of the day on Sunday, and it'll be the same format, same as before, and you'll have the same time frame, etc. So, and then we'll on that Monday, which will be, I guess, what, the 1st of March, maybe something like that. We'll talk a bit about it. We'll have a bit of or I guess Tuesday, we'll have a bit of a review session for that exam, and it's your opportunity to ask questions and whatnot. My intent for the last exam, as you might remember, was to have an open Zoom link during that exam period where you could pop in and ask questions and whatnot. And but because of the fact that I really can't do Zoom at home, I really don't have the setup to do it. I had to do it on campus. The campus was closed. I just sent everyone a message and an email saying I'll be available by phone or email or on the course site if you have questions. And but barring any more snow events, which I don't know is a very good assumption, I'll do the same, or I'll intend to do the same thing, have an open Zoom link during the exam period. And we've got plenty of time to talk about that. That's a couple of weeks away. Okay. All right. So hopefully everyone can hear me okay. And for those who are watching live, I have a live transcription on, if that's helpful to you. I don't know if you can pick that up on the recorded on the recording of this. If you are wanting that, let me know. There may be a way that Zoom can pull that out. I know that I upload this to YouTube typically, not always, but I generally upload it to YouTube. And mostly because I kind of like to have them together. A lot of instructors, I think, increasingly are finding that since we're recording so much of our class presentations, that if we're ever sick or have an emergency or whatnot, we can simply upload something from some previous class, and that may be a good way to handle class in the event of no substitute is available and whatnot. But so I try to upload them to YouTube, but Zoom may have a facility whereby we can pull out the recorded transcript, or the written transcript, I should say written transcript of the discussion. So if that's something that you are interested in, please let me know. Okay. All right. So I think where we are is we were talking last time about unemployment. So chapter 8 is a chapter dealing with unemployment. And we made the case on Tuesday that unemployment was really a bigger issue than labor unemployment. And I made the case that when economists talk about unemployment, they're talking about unemployment of all inputs, all productive factors in the economy, not just labor, but also productive machinery and plants and transportation equipment and infrastructure in general that is not being employed to its maximum capacity. In other words, it's a condition of inefficiency, productive inefficiency. And that's really what unemployment is from a standpoint, just from a pure efficiency standpoint, and disregarding, just for now, sort of the human aspects. And I'm definitely going to return to the human aspects because it can be a devastating circumstance for people who are unemployed, and probably nobody needs a lot of convincing, but I'm going to give this to you from a pure economic standpoint, and maybe a little bit of beyond economics to talk about why unemployment is something that should be avoided to the extent possible. And I'm going to present it from the context of why should we all be concerned about unemployment, even those of us who feel like we will never become unemployed, or perhaps we're retired, unemployment's not my problem, that sort of thing. I'll try to answer that. And I'll do the same when it comes to inflation. If I get to that today, great. If not, I'll push that into next week. We're actually doing great with regard to the schedule. Usually by about the midway point of the course, which is coming up sometime after next week, well, around next week, I guess is the midpoint. I like to be at the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, which is where we are with chapter 11. So I don't really imagine we'll get all the way through that prior to the exam, but it'll be a good jumping off point to go on to the third segment of the class, which proceeds really right out of that. Okay. All right. So if there are questions for me, and I continually look over to my right here just to make sure that nobody's got their hand raised or whatever, their virtual hands raised. And we talked last time about the types of unemployment. We said that there are three kinds, and we went through the first type, and I think that's where we ended. I was talking about the first type, which is frictional unemployment. And I gave some examples of frictional unemployment, basically the definition that I provided, which, and by the way, your textbook does not go into great detail about these three types. I'm a little bit surprised because most texts do, and I think that the text orientation of unemployment is to really talk more about the inefficiencies of unemployment, how it's measured and all that. And that's great. I mean, it's whatever the authors want to focus on, but I do think it's important to be able to really differentiate the types of unemployment, because I think that there is a tendency to say all unemployment is all unemployment, that people who are out of work, are doing something wrong maybe, or are, simply not up to the task of finding a job and whatnot. And there are all kinds of judgments that people make about unemployment. And we're going to make the case that there are various kinds of unemployment, some of which, are ones that we as society should deal with through our government, some that probably are not. And the first of these is frictional unemployment. The definition that I gave was that of incidental reasons. And it's a whole laundry list of possible causes for frictional unemployment. The term frictional basically means something is out of whack, out of timing, or is simply due to something that's happened, some event that has caused somebody to be unemployed. And it's really a whole grab bag of reasons, actually. It's people leaving their jobs voluntarily. It's people getting fired for cause. It's people who are laid off by a business for whatever reason, not due to the overall economy, but simply because a business lays people off. And it does happen. And I think it's important to recognize, and we'll get to this when we get to the third one, which is cyclical, that sometimes businesses will lay people off, and it's got nothing to do with the underlying economy at all, really. It's just got to do with the fact that the business wants to change its mix of labor. Sometimes they call it right sizing, sometimes they call it riffing, that is reduction in force, whatever term you want to use. Sometimes it has nothing, in fact, sometimes it only doesn't have nothing to do with the broader economy and the health of the overall economy. It may have nothing to do with how well the company is doing. The firm may be making gobs of money, but simply decide that maybe the plant in Chandler, Arizona is no longer needed because they're producing a good that is really no longer in demand. The facility is obsolete. It doesn't work very well. It takes a lot to maintain, whatever. You get the idea. There are all kinds of reasons beyond the fact that the economy may be in trouble. So frictional unemployment, we also talked about recent graduates, people who are graduating from some particular program, whether it's a trade school, some sort of training, some sort of educational experience, and are unemployed for a time. Sometimes this is actually a voluntary condition. In fact, a lot of these frictional unemployment examples are voluntary cases in which people simply leave a job for whatever reason and decide to simply take some time off. And that's a good situation if you're able to do that, to be able to take a bit of time off, a few weeks, a few months, whatever. It does happen, particularly if you've got the ability to do that. And so we would call those folks frictionally unemployed as a result of that. And then one that I said was sometimes, depending upon who one talks to in the econ field, would be a fourth category here, which is called seasonal, but we would tend to dump that here into frictional. Those are all the workers who lose their jobs after a particular time of the year has elapsed, and it's no surprise to them. They know it's going to happen. There are people who are employed in harvesting, growing crops throughout the year, who begin sometime around September and then sometime in November, and they just work like crazy. They work like 7 days a week, 12, 14 hours a day, harvesting, and then their jobs are over, and they kind of move around. There are companies, entire companies that do this, and they sort of move from north to south as crops are ripening and ready to be harvested. And that would be an example of frictional unemployment to those people who are out of work, or people who are involved in any kind of a sports situation. If you work at Ice Domes Park selling hot dogs or whatever, you become frictionally unemployed once that season ended. Okay, so a lot of things go into frictional unemployment. We'll talk about, with all these, we'll talk about what the response should be on the part of government. The second one is structural unemployment. So we talked about frictional last time. Let's talk about structural. The definition of structural unemployment is there's a mismatch between workers' skills and the demand for those skills. Whatever those skills happen to be, they're no longer in demand. Of the three types of unemployment, this is considered to be the most difficult. And one of the reasons it's the most difficult is because of the fact that the burden here really lies on workers to make some pretty radical changes, and that really there's nothing that anybody can really do for workers who are structurally unemployed, because we're saying, unlike frictional unemployment, which is often temporary, it's just a frictional timing issue, or maybe somebody has been laid off and they'll find a job in a couple of weeks or whatever. Structural unemployment means somebody is no longer working because whatever they're doing is no longer in demand. Because why? It could be jobs replaced by technology. That's a big one. Whatever they were doing is no longer in demand because the demand for the labor input is no longer needed because they're replaced by technological inputs. And this is a long running story in the Industrial Revolution. It goes all the way back to the very beginning, where if the Industrial Revolution was considered to have begun in England and France with the textile industry, that is the making of any kind of apparel or the cloth or draperies or anything that's made of fabric, once machinery came into play, people lost jobs. They were dislocated as a result of that. And that's probably the first instance where jobs were being replaced by technology. That is, machines could do things better than people in some cases. And this is oftentimes a very, in fact, a lot of the elements of structural unemployment are difficult for people to hear. And it really sounds like, the brave new world is upon us, and it's a dangerous place for people who are structurally unemployed. And maybe that's a pretty fair assumption in some cases. We talk about jobs replaced by technology. You need to look no further than the fact of all the jobs that no longer exist because they're replaced by technology. Think about, even if you go back just maybe 30 years ago, there were lots of occupations where the job title was secretary. That is, today, to the extent that there even are secretaries, they're usually for fairly high-ranking people within organizations and bureaucracies of all kinds. And they usually have the title of administrative assistant. They tend to be much more professionally oriented, can sometimes make decisions in the absence of whoever the boss is. But the old style clerical position of secretary, of answering the phones, taking messages, filing things, typing, doesn't really exist because it's replaced by technology. If you can't get a hold of somebody within an organization, you leave them a voicemail. You don't leave a message. You leave them a voicemail. You send them an email. You send them a text message. You message them somehow technologically, and they get it, and they respond, or they don't respond, or whatever, But there's no real person doing it in terms of filing. we don't have anywhere near as many filing cabinets within organizations as we used to. A lot of things are digitally there, and we simply could put them there ourselves and retrieve them ourselves without the need of that particular occupation. That occupation is largely vanishing, isn't it? And what I really think is interesting about that is the fact that just as that job was sort of going away as an occupational category, came the emergence of Secretary's Day, which I don't know if anybody's worked in a place that has celebrated Secretary's Day. And I know that I think that sort of came along when I sort of entered the workforce. And it was very controversial, I can tell you, because a lot of people didn't want to be called secretaries, those who were working in some sort of role. They thought that was a step below where they were because that job had no longer been around. And so, it was sort of a difficult thing. That job is largely gone. But look at other jobs, phone operators. Many more people used to be employed as phone operators. You see old television shows and movies where somebody picks up the phone and immediately talks to the operator to try to be connected to somebody. I can't even tell you the last time I talked to a phone operator. I think the last time I was trying to do something internationally and I needed to get a phone operator, and that was a nightmare in its own right, because it was a long wait just to get somebody on the phone. And by the way, any kind of a phone operator in general they're hard to get on the phone today. And it's not just pandemic related. It's been made worse by the pandemic just because of the labor shortage and whatnot. But I think I was on the phone with my bank about a month or two ago, and I was on the phone with somebody who number for half an hour before somebody came on. And it was just a real quick question. It wasn't, I actually sort of thought I knew the answer, but I just needed some confirmation. I was moving some money around and whatnot, and I just needed a quick answer. And it was a nightmare getting through to somebody. And I was always afraid I was going to get cut off. That in itself is a problem. I think that because we've replaced so many of those particular service jobs with technology, because believe me, that phone tree really wanted to answer my question with the computer. Press 1 if you want this, press 2. Well, the thing I had to do was not on the menu at all. I wasn't even close to what I needed. I just needed a person, and I kept hitting 0. It was very, very frustrating. And service providers of all kinds have replaced a lot of those jobs by technology, and those people are structurally unemployed. One big area of the economy that we've noted in the last, 20 years at least, probably, that's even picked up speed, is the auto industry. These had traditionally been high-paying jobs with union representation, good benefits, retirement benefits. And a lot of those jobs have been replaced, and a lot of them have been replaced by robotics within manufacturers, particularly on tasks that are of repetitive nature, like welding a quarter panel onto a frame, or doing something, putting these, gluing this onto this part A to part B, whatever. You get the idea. A lot of those jobs are gone, and they're not coming back. They're just not coming back. And all the jobs that have disappeared over time, such as blacksmiths and horseshoe makers and candle makers and all that. And I know that whenever I say something like a blacksmith, somebody's going to say, "Hey, I know a blacksmith." And I'm sure there are blacksmiths out there, but that's really not an occupation so much that exists. That's structural unemployment from a technological point of view, and it's been going on forever. Now, here's the thing about it, and this is having given you all this litany of misery with regard to structural unemployment, and it is kind of a bad form of unemployment. The reality is that what tends to happen is not that these workers are permanently out of work. It's just that they have to find something else. They have to move on to some other form of occupation. This is what, in fact, makes structural unemployment the most difficult, is because the onus, that is the burden, is really on the worker to, number one, accept the fact and understand that that job is gone and is not coming back. And two, to figure out what to do next, which oftentimes means some sort of training, retraining, leaving the industry, going on to something else. And it happens all of the time. And it's simply part of the what we call creative destruction, that things are being destroyed as things are being created. And it's just sort of the renewal process, as painful as it might be for those who are caught up in the middle of it. And there are lots of examples. And I know in my own family, my sister-in-law had a job, a well-paying job. She was self-employed, and she used to make the molds that would be, or I what do you want to say, like the models that would be the cast for injection moldings for action figures. So she did a lot of the Star Wars action figures back in the 80s when action figures were really starting to come on big. And she had a lot of work doing that, creating Han Solo and all that. And that work was eventually replaced by computers, by technology. They didn't need her to do something in 3D. They would do it on their own. And so she had to figure out what her next move was. And so she, I think, did some retraining. I think became a web developer, and I think she's retired now, but for the most part. But that was an example of her needing to really understand that job is gone and it's leaving. So jobs replaced by technology is a big one. Also, the whole idea, which is extremely controversial, of what's known as outsourcing, or sometimes called offshoring. Outsourcing or offshoring, same thing, really depends on. I just give you both terms because you may have heard it both ways. Outsourcing is basically this: it's producers who, or sellers or producers, it's typically producers of goods who are moving their production somewhere away from the area where they once were. And offshoring sort of implies that it's leaving the United States, if we're talking about the US. It doesn't even have to be. I mean, outsourcing has been going on for a very long time. And I think I may have talked the other day about the fact that, well, just going back to the textile industry, that very old industry that was one of the very first to become industrialized. That is, and by industrialization, we mean mass production, creating standardized products, employing workers on a fixed time period, producing, mass quantities of goods that nobody could produce in their home, and leaving their homes in order to do work, which was the first time that it really happened, since manufacturing really began. But in the textile industry in this country started in New England, then it moved south to the Carolinas, then it moved south to the deep south, and then it sort of left the US altogether, to the point where we don't really manufacture all that much in the way of textiles. That is things like, clothing and, towels and, draperies and all that sort of thing. So outsourcing, offshoring, it's simply a cost issue almost always. And sometimes you hear about it being a regulatory issue where a producer simply doesn't like the regulations that are going on wherever it is that producer is operating. So therefore decides to pack up their belongings and move elsewhere. It's not always that easy, but sometimes that does happen where the regulatory regime is so severe that they don't want to be involved in it. We've heard stories about the oil industry doing that from time to time, particularly when governments have tried to impose their own exercise over the money that's being earned by pumping and shipping oil and all that. And oil companies have packed up and left, really to the detriment of the countries that have tried to impose that. But the people who are involved then become structurally unemployed as a result of that. So that's a particular issue there. So jobs replaced by technology, outsourcing, offshoring, and just general obsolescence, I think, is what we're really talking about. Occupations that no longer exist simply because the outputs that are being created no longer require the inputs that are needed to make those. Okay. And that would go with like the blacksmithing. I mean, not too many people buy horseshoes, and so as a result, blacksmiths aren't nearly as needed. So because the output is not needed, the input is not needed. The input is where labor comes into the picture. So this is why it's the most difficult, is because those two issues that I talked about, where the onus is on the worker to understand that this is a permanent situation, and two, that the worker really has to get going to try to find some other kind of occupation if he or she wants to continue working. And really, there's not a lot that others can do for this particular worker, other than maybe give good advice and leads and tips and experiences and whatnot. I know that we're going to make the case here in a bit that of the three kinds of unemployment, there's really only one that government is really that effective at dealing with, and it's not structural. And it sounds like it should be structural, given the fact that we have described it as being the most difficult. But the reason it's not is because there are really only limits that government entities can do. And government, it's not that government entities don't try. I mean, like a lot of unemployment offices, or whatever they're called, unemployment divisions. I think in New Mexico we call it Division of Workforce Security. Really try to create resources whereby people are shown the way to how to apply for jobs, how to interview, how to follow up on interviews, how to get job skills, how to get necessary training, all those kinds of things. And so because frankly, it is a chaotic world of trying to find a job. And in fact, there was a whole series of books called What Color Is Your Parachute? That, when I say series, it was a one edition after the other. It was continually updated. And I read when I was leaving graduate school, trying to find out what to do with the rest of my life after I left. And it basically talked about the fact that it is a chaotic process. There is no central clearinghouse where you can simply say, I'm here, I've got a master's in whatever, or a bachelor's in whatever, or a certificate in this. I mean, you've got to pretty much go get your job yourself. And if you lack those skills, which a lot of people do, sadly, it can become difficult. And I have a family member who probably is, I would imagine, is one of the worst interviewers, period. Just, I'm sure she does terrible interviews. And it's just her personality, just not a people person, just really doesn't connect. Is very proficient at what she does, but I think it's just very, very poor at it. And as a result, I think it's difficult for her to get jobs, really. I do. I really believe that. So anyway, not that I've ever gone along with her to an interview, but I've been in my share of interviews on both sides of the desk. I've interviewed people as a hiring manager, and I've also sat in interviews as a prospective employee. So I have a pretty good idea what's going on within that whole situation. Okay. All right. The third is cyclical. Cyclical is simply this: it's unemployment due to poor business conditions. Okay. So unemployment due to overall poor business conditions. So here we're talking about the macroeconomy itself, which is dragging down parties which had nothing to do with maybe the causes of the downturn in the first place. So one can simply look at, look at the 2007 to 2009 drawdown in the economy due to the problems with real estate, the massive overvaluation of real estate, a massive overlending on real estate, particularly residential real estate, by lenders, including banks and mortgage companies. And when that whole bubble burst, it took on a lot of other entities like, banks, for instance, but also anybody connected with real estate, primarily, such as builders. A lot of people in the construction business lost their work because it sort of dragged them down. And I don't know that it was really structural. I don't know that you could say there's anything structural that construction workers can no longer go back and be construction workers, which is what we're really saying about structural unemployment. We're simply saying construction workers were out of work through no fault of their own. And maybe all of these are in some cases could be no fault of their own, but it's simply they're along for the ride and not in a good way because the economy itself is collapsing. So pretty much anything connected with real estate really felt sort of a big downdraft in that recession. The mortgage business basically went kaboom. I mean, we used to have many more mortgage companies, and very few survived. Even among the bigger ones, Countrywide Mortgage, which was the largest mortgage company in the country, I think is now just a small subsidiary of Bank of America Corporation. Whatever is left of it, Merrill Lynch, which was at one time the biggest investment firm in the country, is also now a subsidiary of Bank of America. It is a fraction of its once mighty size. They were just along for the ride and got taken down by that. And so cyclical unemployment is poor economic conditions, which takes everyone down with it, or many people affected, particularly those not impacted. And by the way, because of that economic downturn, which was pretty swift and severe, and I think it surprised a lot of people. And I would have to say that there were very few macroeconomists who saw that those problems happening around before 2007, and predicted the eventual difficulties that the economy would have. And I know it's been a few years. It may not be that fresh in anyone's minds, or it was not something that was necessarily being paid attention to, but it was a very steep fall off of the economy very quickly. We had all kinds of it was a little bit scary because you had big financial firms just either toppling over altogether or requiring massive government intervention to stay afloat. And we'll come back and talk a bit more about that when we get to the piece on banking and money in banking. And we'll talk about how just unusual and strange that period was, because I think that for most of us, we have long associated finance with being this paragon of stability, and banks have gone out of their way to create big buildings with big granite buildings and steel vaults and polished floors to make it look like they're solid and stable. When in fact, some of them weren't that solid, weren't that stable. and they were probably less stable than some of their less creditworthy borrowers, which is a pretty shocking thing to have uncovered. And we'll get to that a bit later. Okay, so these three kinds of unemployment, what are we really talking about here when we talk about what government can do? We're going to make the case that there is no problem with the worker and there's no problem with the economy when it comes to frictional unemployment. I've got this in the PowerPoint slide that's entitled Macroeconomics Weeks 4 and 5. So I'm a little bit behind with the dating of this, but I'll give you the slide orders that you want to review just as a supplemental pack, just as a supplemental resource as we prepare for the exam. Again, I have said before, and I'll probably say again, that the PowerPoints are, they're not intended to have great value, certainly not there to replace the text, definitely not there to replace what we do in the classroom, but they're just there to organize our thoughts. And so when we talk about no problem with the worker, we're saying that workers are out of work for whatever reason. Now, I know that among frictional unemployment are people who are fired for cause, that is, people who are fired for, you name the reason, not showing up for work, showing up repeatedly late, taking 3-hour lunches, you name it, all kinds of things that can move you quickly through the disciplinary process, and if it's bad enough, all the way out the door without any kind of process. And so you can say, well, there's a problem with that worker. Well, I guess you could, yeah, I guess you could, but oftentimes people are fired from jobs, then move on to the next job where these problems don't materialize again. And it's pretty amazing how people are resilient and can bounce back. And I know that it doesn't seem that way when somebody's out of work right away, but oftentimes once you find another job, you're in a new situation, and maybe you've learned your lesson and it won't repeat the same problem again. So whatever that is, so being fired for cause. It doesn't always mean that somebody's up to no good. It just means that they are not doing what is required for that particular expectation. And maybe it's not a good fit in the first place. Maybe it's not a good fit in the first place. And I saw some article yesterday. I don't even know how I got to this. I was reading it online about a psychologist saying that if people feel like, why do I feel like I'm in the wrong place? It's because you're in the wrong place. That was what she was saying. If you feel like you're in the wrong place, then you probably are in the wrong place. And maybe it's sometimes that you need to do something else. Nothing wrong with that. So nothing wrong with the worker, and there's nothing wrong with the economy. So therefore, no government action is needed with frictional unemployment. And in fact, there's always going to be frictional unemployment. I don't see how you would ever even attempt to outlaw it, because it's all these incidental reasons that cause people to become unemployed. So that's the issue there. We're saying there's nothing really to be done about it. Structural unemployment, we're saying, and I want to I know I say there's a problem with the worker, and I know that sounds a little bit harsh, but I don't know any other way to really put it. The issue is with the worker, but we're saying there's no problem with the economy. And it might sound like both of those are a little bit wrong. In fact, in the first case, could I have said it a different way? Yeah, maybe, I guess. But the issue is with the worker, the burden is with the worker. I think that's a fair statement. But the second part of that is there's no problem with the economy. You might say, what do you mean there's no problem with the economy when people's jobs are being replaced and the jobs are moving overseas or moving to China or to Malaysia or whatever? Well, we're saying this is a natural process, and it's been going on forever. Jobs have been moving around, and sometimes people can go with the jobs, sometimes they can't go with the jobs, and oftentimes they cannot, and so the jobs leave and they're gone. Or if they're replaced by technology, there's just no way for people to sort of, to stay with that particular organization, simply because whatever they do is no longer in demand. So we're saying there's no problem with the economy because we're saying this is a natural evolutionary process. It's a painful process, but what is the alternative? Because if you consider the fact that technology and the continual evolution of technology requires different inputs over time, because the outputs themselves are changing, and we're all responsible for demanding different outputs. I think that if we weren't okay with pumping our own gas because it's faster, then we probably would have people pumping our gas for us, so we didn't have to get out of the car and clean our windshield and pump gas, which, by the way, used to be done for people. And I think there are still a couple of states in the country that's required. I think New Jersey, I think maybe Oregon. I don't know, but in most places if you want gas, you pump your own gas. But I remember even as a kid, you never pumped your own gas. In fact, they didn't want you to pump your own. They didn't want you touching their stuff. They wanted to do it for you. And, and they would check your oil and your water and, your windshield wiper and fluid and all that. Today, you're pretty much on your own. It's, but people want it that way. They want to get in and get out in a minute and a half and get gas and get flying down the road. And the only thing that they might need from the people inside is to be able to sell them some Slim Jims or cigarettes very quickly so they can get back on the road. So we demand that particular kind of output. We also don't really mind the fact that we can press, this number to get this particular thing that we need from, our insurance company or whatever. So we're the ones doing the demanding of these. And so the inputs are changing as a result of our changing demand for output. So we're saying this is a natural evolutionary process, as difficult as it is. And we do acknowledge that it is the most difficult process to go through, particularly if you're the worker, because of these difficulties. The third one, we're saying there's no problem with the worker, and there's no question about this. In fact, the workers who are unemployed due to cyclical are simply along for the ride and completely along for the ride. We're saying the problem is with the economy, and this is the only one that requires government action. No government action here. Government action is required to deal with cyclical unemployment. And when we talk about what government action is needed, we go back to what is called stabilization policy, which we just introduced just briefly, I think even before the first exam. And as I mentioned that time, we will talk much more about that as we get going. Sometime after the second exam, we'll go into the two main forms of what are called stabilization policy. Fiscal policy, which deals with things like government spending and government projects and government programs, also tax policies that can be used to aid the economy. And then monetary policy, which is something completely separate, which deals with the supply of money and credit. Different actors involved in the economy, but both governmental actors that are responsible for dealing with those kinds of issues. Okay, so cyclical unemployment is the only one that requires government action, and it's simply because of the fact that government is effective at being able to do this. And let me say one thing about this prior to moving on, and that is that I think probably even the acceptance by government policymakers that cyclical unemployment is something that needs to be addressed is something that was not the norm prior to the Great Depression. I know the Depression has been a while, it's been about 90 years or whatnot, but all the time in the United States history, in fact, all the time in history up until that point, if people were out of work, the natural feeling was, well, it's temporary, people will get together and they'll work. In fact, what is known as classical economic, the classical school of economic thinking, which goes really all the way back to the very beginnings of thinking about economics, which was thinking really about economics, politics, and government, and philosophy, and a lot of other things. Back in the 17th, 18th century, the feeling was that if people were out of work, that they will find work. And in fact, what will happen is, if you can't find work, you'll eventually accept a lower wage than you took previously. Even if the wage continues to fall, then you will, it'll make employers more willing to hire, and more willing to hire more people because of the lower wage. And then eventually, once the economy recovers, the wages will rise, and workers can maybe go on somewhere else, particularly once the economy improves and other job opportunities exist. And that was the idea that the whole thing is self-correcting. Well, that whole thing was exposed as a real myth, I think, by the 1930s, when the emergence of what is known as Keynesian economics came to the fore. It's based upon the work of an economist named John Maynard Keynes, of whom we'll talk much more about. In fact, there's a chapter later on in the text that will deal with his work. Well, Keynes basically said in the 1930s, what do you mean by self-correcting? Because he was writing really in the middle of the Depression. His major work that dealt with what to do about cyclical unemployment was published in 1936, which was sort of a little over halfway through the Depression, but a depression which had been going on at that point for about 7 years. And he was saying, look, if it's self-correcting, when is it going to self-correct? We're waiting on the self-correction. It is wrong. It is not self-correcting. We can do something about it. We should do something about it. And this idea of activist government really began during that time, which I know a lot of people at the time thought was absolutely diabolical. The government should want to do things like spend money to try to put people back to work. Today, I don't think that's quite the view. A lot of people thought it was really, really not the role of government to put people back to work, that it's up to other people. And you can get the idea too, that there were probably some voices saying, if you're out of work, it's your own fault, that sort of thing. Get off the couch and go look for a job. I mean, I think, and we probably still hear that to some extent. Economists today, I think, recognize that there is a large segment of the unemployed that from time to time are simply dealing with things that are difficult to deal with, that jobs are difficult to find. And not only that, but it's another thing too, I know that it was very frustrating to economists that a statement made by President Reagan in the 1980s absolutely infuriated people, because he said that there were 10 million unemployed people in the country at the time, or whatever the figure was. I think it was 10 million, and then there are 10 million business firms. And if every business firm just hired one worker, the unemployment problem would go away. And I think too, and that sounds like it's a very logical argument. Oh, okay, well, why doesn't every business hire one worker? I think if you gave it no thought, but just sort of went with that, you'd say, okay, hey, that makes sense. But the problem is this: while firms are being asked to hire an additional worker, they're actually laying workers off. They don't want more workers, they want fewer workers. And it's not just a firm hiring one worker. We're talking about firms laying off 4,000 workers. And those 4,000 workers, they're trying to find jobs which are not there in Saginaw, Michigan, and Moline, Illinois. Those jobs are not there. If they want a job, maybe they'd have to move to Sarasota, Florida, or whatever. So we have to be careful about these simplistic arguments that unemployment's easy to fix if only businesses would do this, because it's a spatial issue of location. There are some parts of the country where to try to get a job is very difficult. And I have long, wondered why. Well, I wondered for a long time why the unemployment rate in New Mexico is a bit higher than it was the national average. Not hugely, but a little bit. I think a lot of it is because we've got a lot of rural areas in this country, in this state, where I don't know where a lot of people would go to work if you're living in some of these very remote places. I really don't. I mean, we have a lot of very small towns that are really, 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 really far from any kind of employer, other than maybe a convenience store or a grocery store or whatnot. And while those are okay jobs to have, they're not typically associated with high-paying, high-skilled sorts of work. So you get the idea that the jobs aren't always where the jobs are needed. So as a result, labor mobility is a big thing. And by the way, I've done my share of labor economics, and I don't really consider myself a labor economist, but I think one of the things that has explained the fall of the unemployment rate, which is leading me to my next point here, that we've got a lower what's called full employment rate, mostly because workers today are a little bit more accepting of the fact and understanding of the fact, and have better information that maybe wherever they're living is not the right place to do whatever it is they're doing, and that maybe the thing to do is move and leave. And this is something that younger generations are more more willing to do. I think my parents' generation was not very willing to do that in many cases. My dad was a military officer and had his share of traveling around. So when he did find a job after he'd retired from the Army, he decided he didn't want to move anymore, even though he got offers to go elsewhere. He didn't really want to do that. And today, I think if we're me in his position, I probably would have taken some of those jobs and moved out of state to something else. But, it's a different kind of thinking, a different kind of mindset. He wasn't unemployed, by the way. He was just, other offers came along, and I think people are more willing to accept the idea of a labor mobility than what people used to be. So I think that's potentially a good thing. It does mean leaving all that you know and love, but that is part of the thing about it. Okay, questions for me about anything we've talked about so far? I try to be mindful about looking for when you do have your hand raised, I see a little red hand pop up, and I don't see it yet. And by the way, I've said this before, but if you want a question, just pop up. And most people don't, and I don't know why, because in the physical classroom, nobody has trouble speaking up. Maybe you're a little more timid sitting at home, so that's it's up to you. But I can hear you if you do have questions. Okay. All right, let's move on. So I mentioned full employment. What in the heck is full employment? Because this is a term I think we've probably heard, and it may not be completely clear what full employment is. So full employment is considered to be the natural rate of unemployment. your text talks a lot about this, where we're going to make the case that these terms are going to be used mostly interchangeably. Full employment, which is the same thing as the natural rate of unemployment, which, by the way, is also synonymous with another term that you might see. I don't think it's discussed in your OpenStax text, but you may run across it, which is also known as another thing, which is called the NAIRU, which stands for the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, which is a mouthful, I get, but the point I'm making is that full employment, which deals with the unemployment rate, natural rate of unemployment, which is an unemployment rate, again, these are percentages, and the non-inflation, non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment are all expressed as percentages, and they're all basically the same thing. And they're associated with the full employment rate of GDP. So full employment GDP, and when we talk about full employment GDP, we're simply talking about the algebraic symbol Y sub FE. Okay? So, but there are two different sorts of metrics, aren't there? Because unemployment and the full employment rate of unemployment, and by the way, sometimes we call it the full employment rate of unemployment, which is an even bigger mouthful, or simply full employment, or the natural rate of unemployment, or the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. These are again expressed as percentages. Full employment GDP is expressed as a dollar figure. So obviously these are different things, but they all relate to the same kind of condition in the economy. And the idea is that with full employment, everybody who wants to work is able to find work. Okay, and by the way, when we talk about full employment, what we're really talking about here is frictional plus structural only. That the only unemployment is frictional plus structural unemployment only. And so what do we mean here? We're saying that if it's we're saying it's full employment, and yet there's unemployment. Well, what do we mean by that? Well, it goes back to what we just talked about, was the idea that there's always going to be some unemployment, some frictional for all kinds of reasons, some structural because of these structural changes with regard to how we produce goods. So it's frictional and structural unemployment only. And in other words, there is zero cyclical unemployment. And therefore, this leads us to what is known as the so-called natural rate of unemployment. And I do like this part of the chapter that talks pretty extensively about the natural rate of unemployment. And I like the fact that the authors talk about the fact that this is a sort of a squishy area in some cases. And in fact, it's not nailed down. It's not frozen in cement as to what that rate is and what it should be, because it changes over time. And in fact, just to give you a bit of insight into this, I graduated as an econ major in 1985. I know it's been a while. I've been around a while. And at that time, we were coming off a pretty deep and dark recession. I mean, we had unemployment of about 11% for about a year or two nationwide. The part of the country where I was living, the upper Midwest, there were parts of that, pockets, which the unemployment rate, and we're talking about the adult unemployment rate, we're not talking about 16 and 17-year-olds. The adult unemployment rate was about 25% in some cases, in some places in Michigan. A lot of it had to do with the auto industry and all the related industries that go into it. Things like firms that make carpeting and plastics and automotive and batteries and all the components for that, tires, etc. We're all suffering as a result. And there was no question it was a cyclical condition of unemployment for the most part. But coming out of that, by the mid-'80s, when the economy was back to going great guns to a condition of full employment, of full employment GDP, we started out about 11% GDP. We fell to about, 11% unemployment, and fell to about 7% and just sort of stopped there. And I remember I had a professor at the time who said, maybe 7% is the natural rate of unemployment. This is the frictional and structural rate together. There's no cyclical, because anybody who wants to find a job can find it. It may not be exactly what he or she wants, which is what we've got, which is what often occurs with structural unemployment. Somebody's working at a job, that job goes away for various reasons, and rather than going without a paycheck, to find some kind of work. But nonetheless, that is work, nonetheless, it is employment. But maybe 7% was the best that we could do. And that I think was an assumption for a long time. As we got into the 2000s and 2010s, we had years of prolonged expansion, and we will talk more about this idea that of business cycles and the trend since about those early 80s, that deep dark recession has been longer expansions, shorter and shallower recessions, long expansion, short, shallow recession. As opposed to going back to the 19th century, and again, the data is not good, but what we can see is big booms and big, huge busts that lasted a long time, full-blown depressions, not recessions, full-blown depressions, which are defined as something really majorly messed up in the economy, such as entire industries taking other industries down, whether it's, or something in the financial sector often, whether it's problems with the stock market, problems with speculation in gold, problems with major industries, railroads or whatever. But that experience was we had some major depressions in the 19th century, the 1800s. And we have moved beyond that to the last major depression was the 1930s. But I do recall back in 2008, people saying, are we headed for another Great Depression? And in fact, the people called that downturn the Great Recession because it was pretty deep and pretty fast. It came upon us, and a lot of people didn't see it coming. I didn't certainly see it coming, even though I was very concerned about some of the real craziness in real estate values. I did not see that thing happening, but it was not a full-blown depression. And in fact, that recession, we got out of it fairly intact and had periods of sustained growth, which has really only been sort of interrupted here by the pandemic. And now, because we have an inflationary condition, we've got a Federal Reserve poised to tighten the money supply. It's going to happen. They've been very clear about it. In fact, in many people's point of view, and I'll just say from my own perspective, I'm one of these. They're probably a little late to the party that we had a very hot inflation number just a couple days ago. And so I'll get to that in the inflation piece in a minute. Okay. So 7% was considered good for a while. Today, I think we're saying somewhere between 4 and 5% is the quote unquote natural rate of unemployment. Natural being this is where we naturally are going to be, that there's always going to be some unemployment for all kinds of various reasons, and maybe 4.5 is maybe a good place to sort of split the difference. And what's happening now is that there is a lot of people are thinking, well, maybe we're going to overshoot that to the downside, which sounds like a good thing, that we'll maybe get into the 3% unemployment range. But that would be operating probably at a point where we can't sustain it. There are also other issues that we talked a bit about last time with regard to labor force participation, because there are a lot of people who we're not even accounting for because they've left the labor force, but they could come back in if we needed them to come back in. And we do see this sometimes happen where wages get so high that it really sort of motivates people to come back into the workforce. We certainly saw this in the late 90s when a lot of companies were advertising very high wages for very entry-level jobs that didn't require any skills, and it brought a lot of people into the labor force who weren't there before just because the wages that were being paid were attractive. We're starting to really see that now, aren't we? Okay, so that's full employment, and it's associated with the GDP that is associated with that full employment. So whatever the GDP figure is that gets you at that number tells you that we are pretty much considered to be at full employment GDP. One thing about it, if these unemployment terms have the same thing going on with them, then this is also known as potential GDP. Potential GDP. Full employment or potential GDP is the very same thing as full employment GDP. Okay. Now, here's the thing: when it comes to GDP and this idea of full employment GDP, and that is the idea of an output gap. Okay, an output gap. And so, what is an output gap? An output gap is a variance where GDP differs from, or the actual GDP differs from the full employment GDP. Okay. The actual unemployment differs from the full employment GDP. And there are really two forms of this. One is higher, one is lower. So what about a case in which the actual GDP is less than the full employment GDP? We would simply refer to that as a recessionary gap. An output gap, but specifically a recessionary gap. That is, the economy is operating at a level of GDP below full employment, and so what would be the policy response? It would be to step on the gas, increase GDP activity, however you want to do it, to get the economy moving again to close the gap, so that they become equal to one another, and then we're at full employment, whereas the potential of full employment GDP is the actual. And the other condition is a little bit more unusual, but it's one that some are seeing that might happen now, whereas you've got actual GDP greater than full employment GDP. And by the way, if this is associated with an unemployment rate, and people are thinking the unemployment rate nationally may fall below 4 to the high 3s, well, that would be an unemployment rate below full employment, below the natural rate. That is the economy is operating too fast. And you might say, well, what does that mean? Well, it means that we've got an inflationary gap. And I think that there is some evidence right now that we may be approaching that if we're not already there. Remember that this GDP information is historical. We don't really know just today exactly what is happening with regard to GDP. It's historical information. It's usually about a quarter behind, just because information is being tabulated. And as I mentioned before, we talked about national income accounting, that it's revised a couple of times. And so we really don't get good data on like what's happening like this particular quarter, the first quarter of 2022, until probably sometime in the summer. And by then, I think we'll see that we were operating at a very high level of GDP with an inflationary gap, which explains what? Which explains the inflation that we're seeing with prices. I think there's a good argument for that. The economy is operating too quickly. We're seeing wages rise as a result. We're seeing firms begging for workers. We see it all around us all the time. You can't go to any retailer without seeing a sign talking about jobs. I was in Walmart last night, and they were offering, I think the jobs, I think all of them were $15 per hour. And I think that may be the minimum for all occupations in Walmart, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but I think that's the case. And from a full-time perspective, that translates to about $31,000 per year with benefits. And this is a job right off the street. I would imagine as long as you are reasonably able to do the work, you could probably get hired. And that's not a fantastic pay, but it's not bad pay. It really isn't, particularly if you don't have a lot of dependents and whatnot. And if you do, we have support systems, government support systems that will aid in that. But if you have, if you live with another person who has the same sort of wage, together that's about 67,000 a year. That's not a bad. That's around. It's actually a little bit higher than what is currently the so-called median household income. So these kinds of wages, they may not hang around forever, but I would say if somebody's looking for work and has been reluctant to get into the workforce, you might want to be looking to grab some of these many jobs that are being offered out there. And there are a lot of them. I know my wife's company is looking to hire, and they just simply can't find people. And of course, they've also got issues with people passing drug tests, and that's another story altogether, which I don't think I'll get into here. Okay, so a negative output gap is a recession. So the slides I refer to this as a negative output gap, also known as a recessionary gap, or a positive output gap, also known as an inflationary gap. Both of those terms really refer to the same thing. Okay. All right, so I don't think I'm going to get to chapter 9 today. Gosh, I really wanted to get there. So I'm a little bit behind the pace, but I'm not really, because I even long ago decided that chapter 10, I would not spend much time talking about it. I do want to get to it because I don't think we can really get through a macro course without talking about the international dimension. It really is so important, but there are a lot of very sort of technical aspects to that I think are probably not, that we're not well served to cover in great detail. I do want to get to chapter 11, but let's talk about the rest of chapter 8, problems with unemployment. So what did I say earlier in the class session? I said, okay, we're going to present unemployment from this very, sterile sort of way. These are the types of unemployment: frictional, structural, cyclical, and whatnot. And the problem is the worker, the problems are not with the worker, and whatever. And it almost sort of suggests that we're not concerned about the human dimension, but we are. And I'm going to present the problems with unemployment, and you can follow along. I know anybody who's watching or watching the recorded video has got access to the PowerPoints. I'm going to sort of present these problems with unemployment from the standpoint of, number one, just to sort of reiterate what we already know, I think, but also talking about where the research has led us to conclude that unemployment is a very bad thing. As if people need to convince you, we'll give you more evidence even still, and even probably more from a scholarly standpoint, to talk about why we should all be concerned about unemployment, even if we maybe work for a very stable employer, maybe we work for a government agency, maybe we work for the police department. And you can never imagine the police department ever going out of business. So therefore, why is unemployment my problem? Okay, that's a fair question. Or I'm a school teacher and I think things are going well and I'll never lose my job. Well, maybe I should still be concerned. Or whatever, I'm retired. I mean, whatever the scenario might be, we're going to present the case of why we should be concerned, because it does impact society in general. So the first of these is it results in lower personal and disposable incomes. And then I got arrows which lead to what? Well, which lead to the fact of lower spending throughout the economy. And because of that, lower tax revenues being paid to government. So here's the issue with that. So we've got an economic downturn for whatever reason it's caused unemployment. So it means people's incomes are falling. If you're unemployed, you're earning less. Even if you receive unemployment benefits, it's a fraction of what you were earning. And it doesn't usually account for things like overtime and bonuses and whatnot, which a lot of people rely upon in their, in their experience. But that's usually not part of the equation. So as a result, if you're not earning very much, you're not paying that much in taxes. And by the way, if you're earning unemployment benefits only, and as of, I think last year, I don't know what the tax position is, but last year the government simply waived taxes on unemployment benefits for up to, I think the first $10,000 of benefits. But because typically they're taxable, unemployment benefits are taxable. And I don't know what the situation is for 2021, because I know people are now filing their 2021 returns. I should look into that. I don't know the answer, and I'll try to find out what that is. But regardless, if you're earning unemployment benefits, meaning you're not working, you're still earning less and therefore paying less in, to the point where maybe you pay nothing in the way of taxes. And that's okay, because if you earn below a certain dollar figure, depending upon your family size and your filing status, married, not married, whatever, if you don't have enough to pay, you don't pay. You don't have to pay. In fact, you may get money back that you never even paid in the first place through a series of what are called refundable credits, negative taxes. So as a result, government then is being asked to do contradictory things. Number one, pay out those negative taxes, pay benefits with less money in order to do it. And by the way, government is really given is given a mandate to do things which are contradictory to its own budgetary conditions. It's getting less revenue coming in, but at the same time it's getting less revenue, it's going to replace other people's incomes by things like increased unemployment benefits, increased social services in general, things like healthcare assistance, Medicaid for those who are needy, housing assistance in many cases, transportation assistance. You get the idea. It's a big list. In addition to all the sort of one-off programs that were developed by the federal government through the pandemic, just a number of the stimulus checks that we all got, which were known as recovery rebate credits. That is, it was an advance on tax credit, the advanced child tax credit that a lot of us got last year. Those are all forms of government stimulus that were fairly novel. Those are not typical. I mean, getting money in the mail from the government is not typical on a routine basis. So government was being asked to do that. At the same time, it was getting less dollars coming in. So as a result, it was running a deficit, and which is nothing new because the government's been doing that, but we will talk much more about deficit spending a bit later. What are some other problems? It's often difficult to reintegrate back into the workforce when one has been unemployed for a fairly long time period. This is a bigger problem than what meets the eye. Well, and I think that and it's got all kinds of different elements to it. Number one, a lot of it has to do, frankly, with, I guess, the bias and the personal judgments of people doing hiring. And I will tell you that when I was a manager looking to hire people, I looked at people's job applications and resumes, and if I saw gaps in the employment history, I would wonder what the gaps were all about. And sometimes it was easily explained, caring for children, new children in particular, or having ill relatives, or moving out of state, or someone's spouse was in the service and they went overseas and they didn't have a license to work overseas. I mean, there are all kinds of legitimate reasons, but you have to have a legitimate reason. If you don't, your employer just simply is left to wonder why. Why weren't you working? What made you unemployable? again, maybe these aren't even fair questions for the employer to ask, but they're asked, whether they're fair or not. What were you doing? Were you incarcerated somewhere? And what's it going to take for me to find out if you were incarcerated and for what? And is it going to be a problem that I'm going to have? I mean, these are the kinds of things that come up, particularly if we're talking about gaps of a year or two. What on earth were you doing for that period of time? So it's difficult. Not only that, but the work itself has changed. Now, I was in banking for a good part of 20 years, and I know occasionally people ask me, would I go back into banking? And I said, no, I don't really want to go back into banking. And by the way, even if I attempted to, I think things have changed to the point where I think I would have to be retrained in a lot of areas. Some of the regulations have changed. Regulations which, as an economist, I probably wouldn't be familiar with because I don't deal with them on a regular basis. But I would have to be familiar with them working on a daily basis in banking. Some of the new regulations, particularly regarding the deposit function, the speeded up availability of funds, I would have to know about that and some of the lending changes. So no, I've been out of work too long. Me going back, I don't think I would get hired if I were doing the hiring. I don't think I would hire myself. So that kind of gives you an idea. I've been out of it too long. So it becomes difficult to go back to work. There was a lady, I know I'm friends with a lady who was a computer scientist. She actually had a degree in computer science, moved to New Mexico and was pretty high up in some state government agency running their IT systems, and then took a couple of years off because both of her parents became very ill and were very elderly there, and she was it. They had no other children, no other real relatives. So she moved back east to take care of them and came back and found that a lot of the systems had changed, a lot of the software had changed, and she just was not up to the task, and eventually had to go do something else. She was structurally unemployed as a result of that. So you get the idea. You can become structurally unemployed just by being out of work, and the job itself has changed. And are you able to adapt to it? Another thing on this is a fairly long list, but I think it's an important list. And this is a theme that's going to come up again and again and again, as if you weren't already familiar with it. It affects lower income households much, much, much more than higher income households. This probably goes without saying, but lower income household, somebody loses their job and the paycheck stops, and it's an immediate financial crisis for the household. No question about it. It's very difficult. Higher income household, it may not be quite that because they may have some savings. They can maybe cruise on those savings for several months, maybe a couple of years even, or longer. And I can recall, having come from an occupation where there were a lot of highly paid people that occasionally we would shut down departments and lay people off, again, due to nothing having to do with the economy or with how we were doing. And we were talking about traders, bond traders and commodities traders who sometimes were kind of happy about it because they said, I'm going to take the summer off and go surfing or whatever. And that's what some of them did. Now, obviously, that sounds like an extreme luxury to somebody who is just barely getting by. So, a high income household has a different experience than a low income household. You all knew that, but I'm just simply saying that what's happening is there is an inequity with the impact of unemployment. Also, a higher income household usually is associated with a higher skill level, and that person can slide into some occupation at some point. They will maybe come close or even replacing one's income. A lower income household will probably be, if they find work, it may take a while, and it may be around the same wage as before, and maybe not. Maybe not that, depending upon the kind of unemployment, particularly if it's cyclical unemployment. Okay, it also affects minority groups much more than non-minority groups, and we know this. And if for no other reason than the fact that the government does fairly extensive tracking of racial and ethnic groups, gender groupings, age groupings, any way you want to slice the population by characteristic, whether it's racial, age, ethnic, gender, the government has collected all this kind of data. And whatever the minority group we're talking about is, they suffer proportionally higher rates of unemployment and longer periods of unemployment than do non-minority groups. A lot of this is probably due to historical discrimination that still exists. And we know it still exists because there are continually studies that come out by labor economists proving that discrimination in the labor force exists. Nowhere near the extent that it was historically, but the fact that it exists at all, that it's not zero, which it really should be, is still a testament, is still evidence of the fact that it is a disparate effect of unemployment. Unemployment is not felt equally, it's felt disparately. Okay. It's also associated with numerous social ills. We talked about the fact that one inferior good is alcoholic beverages, and that's maybe seems like a luxury good that should be a normal good. But we know that, and by long evidence, that alcoholic beverage consumption increases during economic downturns, and it decreases during economic expansion. So it's considered an inferior good, but it's also a problematic thing. Particularly heavy drinking, particularly addictive behavior of all kinds, is an issue. And I did have an acquaintance who was a psychologist who told me once that one of the most devastating things that can happen, and she was a family counselor, was someone losing their job. That immediately you've got all kinds of stresses and conflicts, such as, do we drop cable TV? Do we sell your car? Do we sell my car? Do we move into a different apartment? Do you take a second job while I try to find a first job? I mean, all those kinds of conflicts that come about. Why are you spending money on ice cream when I'm unemployed? I mean, you get the idea. All kinds of family dynamic issues. And it's also associated at the same time with lots of things like loss of jobs, loss of homes, loss of vehicles. And if you can imagine, the word loss just keeps coming up and coming up and coming up. And if you've lost your job, you end up losing your home, and you lose your vehicle, and you're losing your family, you've lost a lot of what there is to lose. And so that's a very, very difficult situation. We should all be concerned about that because it creates all these other social ills. And we see the rate of property crime increase dramatically during economic downturns, simply because of desperation oftentimes, okay? Let me see here. So anyway, that's the example. Those are some examples of unemployment. We sort of get the idea, and a lot of you are probably concerned or not unfamiliar with these in general, but I'm just sort of laying out the case for why we should all be concerned about it. Even if unemployment does not appear to be our problem, it really is because of these particular kinds of things. Number one, we as a society are trying to support those who are unemployed for however long that period of time is. And by the way, if this pandemic does not come to some conclusion at some reasonable point in the future, and I don't even know what the word reasonable is, I don't know what the long-term impact is going to be on society, on the labor force, on the economy in general. I think we are going to find years from now that this has had is responsible for major economic changes, in addition to social changes and all the other things. Just the very idea of working from home. The fact that you're at home and I'm here, and I'm not complaining about it. I'm simply saying, but I think it's a great thing that you're wherever you are and I'm here. That would have been unheard of when I first started teaching. Absolutely unheard of. When I first began as a college faculty member. But that's a good thing, and maybe that's a good thing that's come out of it. And maybe there are some good things that come out of what has been a very miserable situation. So, but there are problems with unemployment in general. I just want to be able to stress what some of those are. Finally, here before we do that, there are a couple more slides, or actually one more slide dealing with what's called underemployment. And I'll just pick up chapter 9 brand new on Tuesday. So underemployment is a particularly strange phenomenon because it's not really accounted for in any way. We do a pretty good job of accounting for unemployment for the reasons we talked about before. That is, there are surveys that are done to find out who's working, who's not working. Those are a bit problematic because of people not answering their home phones. But more importantly, people who are unemployed tend to file for unemployment, so we know who they are from that perspective. But underemployed people, there's no way that we can sort of, tag them like, like animals in the wild and follow them around. We just can't do that. And we have really two forms of underemployment. One, people who are formerly unemployed who've now got jobs for which they're so quote unquote overqualified. But they took the first job they could find, and as a result, they are overqualified for that particular job. This happens a lot, particularly during very tough economic times, cyclical unemployment. There was a guy that worked for my dad once who, the economy was bad. He hired him. My dad didn't know all that much about him. He had a college degree and whatnot. And then when the economy got going again, the guy said, "I'm leaving." And oh, that's okay. Where are you going? And he said he was going to go be a chemist for, I think, Dow Chemical. He goes, "You're going to be a chemist?" And he was doing something. He was like a salesman for my dad. He said, "Yeah, I've got a PhD in chemistry." And my dad said, "You have what?" And he had no idea that this guy was a chemist who couldn't find work during the economic downturn. I think it was the early 70s. When the economy picked up again, he found the job he really wanted. and he didn't want to be a salesman anymore. And so he took that job. And took the job he was qualified for. And my dad said later, he's not sure that he would have hired him had he known that he was overqualified for the position. And when I say that overqualified for a sales job, we're talking about not a highfalutin sales job. It's it was a very low paid sales job, but he took what he could get. He was not living in a place where there were a lot of jobs for chemists and not in the economy. So that was a condition of over qualification. The other conditions were people who were working part-time, who are working full-time now are working part-time, because we count part-time workers. And by the way, it's really hard to know what full-time and part-time even are. We typically think of 30 hours plus per week as being full-time. We sometimes define full-time workers as those who are benefits eligible, but not all firms have the same kinds of benefits or even any benefits, and they may have full-time workers. And so it's difficult to know. But one thing is for sure, if you're working 40 hours a week and now you're working 20 hours a week, you're still employed. We still count you as employed, not unemployed, but employed, but maybe you are underemployed. And so therefore you're under the radar and we're not accounting for it. So there are all kinds of instances of people who are working in jobs for which they're overqualified that we have no really way of knowing it. And nor does the employer, because oftentimes workers who want the job don't want to really advertise that they, are more experienced or whatever than what they are, because they think they want to get the job right away, or they're working part-time, which is a very common case of underemployment. Okay, so I'm a little bit over. I apologize for that. So are there questions for me about anything regarding Chapter 8? So there's a lot going on in Chapter 8, and I guess, I never really know as to where we're going to end up, but this is a good place to sort of end our discussion. When we come back on Tuesday, we'll talk about Chapter 9, dealing with inflation, and then I'll get into a little bit of the discussion about Chapter 10, and hopefully before the end of the week, I'll be able to start to introduce a little bit about the material from Chapter 11, which really is very critical. So if nobody has any questions, I'm looking to see if there are any hands raised. I'll say have a great weekend, enjoy the snow, and I'll see you next time.